Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. I'm Hermione Paddle. I'm a teacher at the Bavarian International School. And today I am chairing a session for Patrick Alexander from Oxford Brookes University. And he's going to be talking to us today about the case for intellectual well-being in teacher professional learning. And so I think essentially what he's going to do is explore this whole concept of intellectual well-being. And he's going to look at this through the lens of Simone de Beauvoir, kind of arguing that, I guess, prioritising intellectual well-being is something of a challenge for international schools. And I think I would agree with that. In doing so, he's going to explore this whole idea of teacher professional identity and then ultimately share with us some strategies about how to nurture intellectual well-being in schools. So without further ado, I will let him do the talking. If anyone's got a question, maybe just note it down and we can save it until the end. And I'm happy to have, raised hands, or you can put your question in the chat. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Hermione, and thanks so much everyone for having me today. Really pleased to be here to talk about this concept of intellectual well-being exactly along the lines that you've suggested, Hermione. And I wanted to add the Lausanne American School logo there on the front, just to give some special thanks to Paul, who's also on the call here, for offering up some time last week for me to act as a visiting visiting scholar there. Where we got to kind of deepen some of the thinking around intellectual well-being and kind of contextualize it, which I think is also always an important thing to try and think about where these theories come from, but also how they can be applied in a way that's productive to the specific setting that you're in. Okay, so I'm hoping to talk generally about this concept of intellectual well-being that I developed with my close colleague, Jacques-Olivier Perche from the English Schools Foundation in Hong Kong. And to keep that talk to about half an hour, so we've got plenty of room for actual dialogue. So I'm looking forward to that. And of course, as Hermione said, feel free to whack in any questions into the chat or to just interrupt me as I'm going along. So let's start with an important question. As Hermione mentioned, for some of us, it's a half-term break, so you might be taking some well-earned sort of pause from your normal working schedule, or you might be juggling kids and work at home, or dogs, or elder care, or other things. Where I am in Spain at the moment, there is a yellow rain warning in place, but no rain. So schools have been closed for 2 days in anticipation of some bad weather that is yet to come. So that is kind of interfering with my background at the moment, the background noise. But I just want to ask these questions to you, and to offer you, just a few minutes of serious contemplation for thinking about these questions. Now, obviously, I haven't explained what intellectual well-being is yet, but I want you to kind of draw your own conclusions at this stage about what you think intellectual well-being is in order to respond to these questions. So how well are you intellectually today? So just think about today, today so far. How well are you feeling intellectually? How well served is the kind of intellectual part of your makeup today? And if you are feeling particularly intellectually well today, who or what is shaping that intellectual well-being? Can you think about what are the kind of things, people, structures that are allowing intellectual well-being to kind of bubble up in your day to day? And if not, then what or who is hindering that intellectual well-being? So think about what could be getting in the way of having a sense of intellectual well-being today, and hopefully just by thinking about those things, we might start to be able to surface some of the bigger picture issues that might be at play, whether those are positive or negative. Okay, I'm just going to give you 1 minute to think about those questions while you look at this picture of an octopus that my daughter drew. So 60 seconds simply to think about what it means to be intellectually well, how you're feeling about that today, and what might have benefited or hindered how you're feeling about those things. So I'm just letting the clock run now. If you do want to add anything in the chat, feel free, but if not, just we can enjoy some silence and contemplate those questions. Okay. Well, thank you. The comment in the chat there that is surfacing, hopefully what I was hoping to would emerge, which is this is an opportunity for some intellectual well-being. So thank you for pointing that out, and hopefully we'll continue in that vein as we go along. Important questions though, right? These are kind of essential questions for the calling of what it means to be a teacher. For the thing that we expect of our students, for the thing that we train to be, for the thing that we go into school to do every day. I want to make the case that intellectual well-being is pretty central to that. And if you want to be able to kind of offer other people the opportunity to do it in their own day, it's important to think about how you can have it in yours as well. So let's think about intellectual well-being as a kind of part of the bigger picture of well-being. Now, obviously, all of us who work in schools, or in fact in any kind of organizational context, will be more than familiar with the various different domains of well-being that exist out there, right? So physical, mental, emotional, all different kinds of domains of well-being that we will have engaged with in different parts of our personal and professional lives. So well-being is a really well-trodden pasture, right? It's everybody knows something about it. A lot of research has been done in it. And yet, ironically or strangely, intellectual well-being is actually a pretty underrepresented domain of well-being. If you throw that term into Google, you'll find lots of different things, largely from the kind of the US HE sector around emotional, intellectual wellness or intellectual well-being. But more often than not, it's a very specific version of intellectual well-being that is characterized in that literature or in that discourse, and it's not necessarily a version of intellectual well-being that I want to advocate for here. So existing in versions of intellectual well-being that are out there are often about sort of, on one hand, cognitive well-being, so thinking about brain health, if you like, or brain training. And so often those are kind of geared towards a more sort of senior demographic. But also there is a general steer in existing discourse around intellectual well-being towards consensus. So this is about sort of wellness described as feeling good or feeling content because a problem has been solved. And sometimes we slightly disparagingly talk about this framing of intellectual well-being as a kind of Sudoku version of intellectual well-being, or the kind of crossword version of intellectual well-being, where you're presented with a project or a problem. You attend to that problem, you solve the problem, you feel better as a result of solving the problem, and then you can go about your day. And so, yeah, on one hand, those things, there is a kind of confluence or conflation, if you like, between cognitive well-being, brain training, and also this kind of feeling of wellness that comes with kind of seeking consensus. Oftentimes, the kind of existing discourse around intellectual well-being kind of fits with broader discourse around well-being that we see at the moment, in so much as it's also hyper individualized. So a lot of well-being discourse focuses on individuals. It focuses on individual responsibility for well-being, and often is this kind of inward-looking approach. And I think mindfulness practice in schools can sometimes be an example of this. That even though mindfulness might be sort of very directly focused at being present in the moment, and sort of being sort of sensitized to the moment. It's often used operationally as a way of of developing the self, right? Of becoming better at something, better focused, so that you can do something else. So often, yeah, intellectual well-being is framed in that kind of hyper individualized, often inward-looking way. And also the discourse of intellectual well-being that we see elsewhere feeds into a broader neoliberal discourse about what it means to be a kind of healthy or successful or well individual self. Often, conflated with the terminology of someone like Maslow, self-actualization, the idea that you should be sort of a sort of high achieving individual who's kind of meeting goals. All of us who work in education can recognize the kind of the challenge or the tension that there is between this sense of feeling well, but also achieving that wellness in a competitive way. Feeling good because you got good grades, while on some level recognizing that the only means by which some people can get good grades is that other people don't get good grades. So maximization through competitive edge, competition. Often there is a kind of underpinning lean towards kind of extraction, the idea that we work in an economic system that is designed around, but absolutely by in its very architecture is about extraction. It's about getting more out than you put in. That's how capitalism works. And so, feeling well as a result of that process, I think there's a problem with that kind of thinking. And also often linked to ideas around resilience. I won't roll out Carol Dweck. I'm sure you've all heard enough about growth mindset, but often intellectual well-being is linked to being resilient, right? To being resilient to challenges around you and kind of rising above those challenges. Now, while there is something useful about thinking about resilience or thinking about resistance, maybe those kind of classical physics sort of metaphors that we get from physics. I think there is also a critique to be made about how resilience is often used in education to kind of point the responsibility towards individuals and to encourage them to simply kind of take whatever whatever countervailing forces are coming their way. So if you're from a marginal position in any social context, you're supposed to be resilient to that marginality, to somehow just take it, to weather the storm. So there are issues, I think, around how people are deploying resilience in relation to intellectual well-being. And then there are also some things that are just simply not logical to be resilient against, like climate change. It's simply not possible to be resilient against certain countervailing pressures that may not be making us feel particularly well. So with all of these sort of potential shortcomings in mind for how the kind of general discourse around intellectual well-being or wellness is framed, we wanted to put forward something a bit different. And this really is where the concept of intellectual well-being that we've devised comes in, and there's a reference at the end of the slides to link to the open access article as well. So we want to start off with this position of dissensus and uncomfortability. So rather than thinking about well-being as a process of consensus, of feeling content, that really there is something powerful. There is a powerful aspect of intellectual well-being, which is a kind of disquiet. It's an unease, a productive unease, but an unease nonetheless. And there is a kind of a sensible way that we could argue that if you are actually happy in the current state of affairs in the world, then there might be something going on behind the scenes. That this is not a kind of a contemporary moment where it's easy to be unproblematically happy or contented. So we wanted to kind of surface that as something that is important to intellectual well-being, this sense of dissensus and being comfortable with uncomfortability, to recognize that there is something productive about getting to the end of a conversation like this and not agreeing about what we think about a thing, to talking to people who you don't agree with and feeling comfortable with an open-endedness, with loose ends still being left frayed. We also wanted to draw on the work of Simone de Beauvoir, as Hermione mentioned at the beginning of the talk, specifically around what she describes as authenticity. And so without getting into too much detail there, the thing that we wanted to focus on was the argument that Simone de Beauvoir makes around how sort of a true ethical being in the world has to be acted upon. So it's not enough for all of us to be, working in our different settings and to make claims about how we feel about what the world should be like, to make ethical claims. It's not enough for us to kind of, at the end of this conversation, agree that we think, this thing and that thing should be done in terms of professional learning. In fact, it could even be quite a damaging or even a violent thing for us to simply state those claims and then go on with our lives without making any changes. And I think my reading of Simone de Beauvoir would be that authenticity can only be achieved. So, to experience your authentic self, you have to act on your positioning. You have to act on what you think is an ethical way of living in the world. And so that is a kind of essential part of what it means to experience intellectual well-being, is to do the work and not just talk about it. Another essential component of intellectual well-being is a relational focus. So trying to move away from the individualized self, to move away from the idea of a rational actor maximizing on well-being, and instead to think about intellectual well-being only as something that can ever be experienced between people. It's never something that is simply an individual experience, because it's always about trying to work with others to create some kind of project which serves a purpose beyond the self. We also draw on Felix Guattari to think about this kind of along the same lines in an ecological way. So this is not even just about intellectual well-being existing between individual humans. It's about trying to imagine and then act upon a kind of whole culture of intellectual well-being that should expand beyond institutions, but in order to recognize that all of us are acting in this much wider ecological world. So there we might think as well along the lines of what the anthropologist Gregory Bateson describes as an ecology of mind. So trying to see our minds as not simply bounded by by the blood and bone and flesh of our individual heads, but to say, well, our minds exist in everything that we do, in the technology that we use, in the material culture that we engage with, in the ecologies that we're part of as animals. And as a result, our intellectual well-being does not exist in our heads. If our minds are everywhere, then our intellectual well-being exists out there in the world, and we're part of that out there in the world. Lastly, to bring this back to teacher professional learning in a very specific way, intellectual well-being, as we describe it, is about critical praxis. It's about the idea of being critically attentive and aware to the conditions in which our practice takes place. So not simply to be able to kind of see and describe what we're doing, imagine any specific lesson or meeting that you're in, but also to kind of step back from that and have a kind of heightened sense, heightened attention, heightened thoughtfulness to that practice, to say, well, why is that the way it is? Why am I doing this? Why are we doing this talk in the way that we are? And then to think about the means that have derived that practice to be the way that it is. And here we draw a little bit on Stephen Kemmis, who talks about practice architectures, the things that give practice the shape that it has. And we can maybe when we have the discussion, we can break that down a little bit. But to think about everything from the kind of material and economic structures that give shape to practice, why you sit in an office and do your work, or why your classroom is organized in the way that it is, where it is in the school, how much money you have to spend on books, all that kind of stuff, the relationships that shape practice, and also the discourse that shapes practice, the things that we can and can't talk about, or the things that we are and are not encouraged to talk about. So all of that is in the mix when thinking about intellectual well-being. And I want to just add this other particular concept that we've developed to try and sort of nuance things a little bit further. So if we're thinking about intellectual well-being as something that kind of underpins practice in schools, something that we can become aware of, then the kind of the feeling of what intellectual well-being is described by this connected concept of noetic syntonia, so which is just a fancy way of saying vibes, as I was talking to with Paul last week. It's basically a way of thinking about the kind of moment to moment experience that we have of being in the world together with other people. The sociologist Hartmut Rosa has developed this language of thinking about a sociology of resonance, thinking about how it is that we try and understand how we connect with other people. And it was nice to come across that work because it absolutely links to what we're trying to do here, which is to recognize, on one hand, the importance of noesis, of a kind of critical intellectual connection with other people, but also of syntonia, of the kind of the rhythms or the resonance that exist between people as they're doing this work. And I think that the key distinction maybe between what we're saying and what Hartmut-Rosa says is that we're talking about not only resonance, so not only those moments when you're talking to someone and you really feel like you're getting it, or you're reading something and it resonates with you and you say, yes, this is talking to me, or you're in your class with your students and you know from experience that things are working. And you can never quite explain exactly why and how, but you know that they are. So it's capturing those aspects of resonance, but also recognizing that resonance often comes from dissonance, right? Often it's important to be attentive to again to dissensus, to when it feels like the notes are out of key and something is going wrong, and you think I can sense that, I can hear it, I can feel it. And as a result of sensing it, you might be able to edge towards resonance again. So those two things being kind of essential components of what we might describe as noetic syntonia, the thing that underpins all aspects of practice and that you can sense on a level that's much deeper than maybe can be expressed in any particular moment. So this is one way that we've described it that hopefully articulates it maybe a little clearer than I have so far. So noetic syntonia is a way of being, an artwork of the self, if you will, that reflects a deep commitment to the intellectual, political, and theoretical qualities threaded into all aspects of the human experience. While noesis refers to the act of serious, critical thinking of being invested in intellectual life, syntonia refers to the rhythms and resonances between persons committed to this practice. Both dissonance and resonance form part of this accord between individuals who come into presence collectively in the ongoing pursuit of understanding and changing the world for the better together. Our contention is that we could hope for and should hope for nothing less than noetic syntonia in our personal and professional lives, and not least in the practice of teachers and their students. So it's a relatively high bar, but one that I think we should aspire to. That schools and universities, any place that claims to be a place of education, should should have this kind of experience at its heart. And of course, if we go back to those questions we asked at the beginning, it doesn't always work that way. And of course, that's why it's important to ask the question, well, if we aren't experiencing intellectual well-being, if we're not engaging in that sometimes uncomfortable, not always consistent, rarely completely aimed towards consensus, that sort of ongoing, difficult but exciting, enlivening process of intellectual engagement of noetic syntonia, then why aren't we? What's the issue? What's the issue at hand? And so I wanted to give this as one example of what the issues can be in trying to seek out intellectual well-being. And this is in the broad context of teacher professional learning, but I'll refer back to the UK example as maybe a kind of a sheer example or a quite sort of a quite discrete example of some issues that get in the way of trying to find intellectual well-being. So I think one of the challenges that we find in teacher professional learning across the board, but maybe particularly in contexts like the UK, is this sort of overemphasis on teacher effectiveness. I think certainly in the UK, but elsewhere, we've seen in the last 10 years, a real emergence of a focus on the science of learning as a means to improve teacher effectiveness. So often, PL, professional learning programs will focus on the different techniques that you might be able to use in order to maximize teacher effectiveness, to get the most from your class in terms of memory, cognitive load, growth mindset, ATLs, you name it. And of course, on one level, there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. A lot of that science of learning absolutely works as a means to achieving teacher effectiveness. But it doesn't necessarily at any point critique what it is that is being effective. And that, I think, is one of the blocks or barriers that potentially we see to the pursuit of intellectual well-being, is that an over focus on teacher effectiveness doesn't necessarily create space to ask the question, what is being made effective? What is the presumed role of the teacher such that what they're doing is more effective now than it was before? Is it the role of the teacher to improve short-term memory? Is it the role of the teacher to maximize the likelihood of, of high achieving test scores, whatever it may be? If your position is that that is the role of the teacher, then a teacher effectiveness agenda absolutely works. But there is an argument to say that there isn't necessarily always a space for us to ask the question, what does it mean to be a teacher? What are we actually doing? What are we doing in our work every day? And potentially there is a byproduct of that around proletarianization, which is just it's harder to say and to spell than it is to think. It basically just means, to what extent is the work of teachers serving to alienate them from the philosophical or ethical underpinnings of what it means to be a teacher. Um, and I think we can see that quite starkly in the emergence of generative AI. That there is an argument to be made that if you're using generative AI to design lesson plans, for example, great, but it could actually put teachers in an entirely technical role in relation to their students, right? So your role in that case is literally to press a button that will derive a lesson plan that can then be delivered. And in that process, you are alienated by one further remove from the actual substance of what it is to deliver a lesson, right? So there is a well, not necessarily a danger. There is a process that could be seen to be happening where, in some cases, technology is used to alienate teachers further from the kind of essence of what it means to be a teacher by ever more focusing on the technical process of delivering learning. So those are some potential barriers that I think I've seen at least emerging in teacher professional learning and in practice. We have to ask the question: if you are a hyper effective teacher, are you intellectually well? Is there space for you to engage in some deep thinking about your implication in your practice, what you're doing, the extent to which it matches with what you wanted to do when you started being a teacher, or what you thought teaching would be like? All of those kinds of questions. And of course, time capital is essential to that process, right? So time is often presented as something that is of extreme value in schools. It is the thing that kind of shapes everything else about practice. Do you have time for anything? And the reason that time is so valuable is because it literally has a capital value, right? We see time in school as being about the importance of focusing on what counts the most, making the biggest return on that time, trying to be efficient with our time. And so time that is left open for discussion, time that is left open-ended in terms of what it's supposed to yield as an outcome, is often not only seen as wasted time, but actually almost as deviant time. I mean, think about if somebody were to see you at the end of the week in the staff room or in your office and said, "Oh, what did you do on Tuesday?" And you said, "I don't know, just kind of sat around thinking about education." There are things that we can't even say. If you had done that, you might be worried to tell someone else that you'd done it in case you got put on some kind of performance review, right, for wasting your time. So that's a kind of interesting challenge as well around time. So obviously, I'm not the first person to say this. There is a long history of literature, particularly in the UK, but elsewhere as well, about how you balance these things in the professional learning and training of teachers. Can we balance a focus on practice with a focus on theory? Practical theorizing is one way to describe it. This idea that you would always see your role as being partly linked to deep thinking about the theory of education. Is there a way to kind of ingrain that in the training of teachers such that you would feel uncomfortable if you weren't doing it, and which is not necessarily how things are at the moment. thinking about, how we get closer to to a kind of ecology of practice, how we think about, the kind of intellectual well-being of an entire community rather than individuals. Thinking about how teachers might be encouraged to see themselves as intellectuals. It's another strange tension that we see in the professional lives of teachers, that there can be a sort of anti-intellectual vein that runs in our worlds. That people roll their eyes at theory and go, is that necessary? Can't we just get on with our work? The extent to which teachers should be seen as wise, high status individuals who have that kind of intellectual role. And Paul, I see your hand. I'm just going to finish this point and then I'll pass over to you. And then also to thinking about the thinking partners that we do this work with, and also the spaces where we're able to have these conversations. So thinking partners, I think first and foremost, authors, things that we read, we listen to, we see. To always have somebody in your life that you're reading. Doesn't have to be highly theoretical, could be literature, could be anything, but somebody who is speaking to you and asking you questions. And of course, to be able to find educational agoras, spaces, common ground where you can have conversations with other people and say, I was reading this book, it was really interesting, I don't quite get it. To be able to have those kinds of conversations that then feed into practice in ways that we often can't fully articulate. That there should be ways that we have those conversations and they spool off into the future in ways that are hard to quantify above all else. Okay, so that's it. That's my spiel for today. Just over half an hour. I want to finish with a couple of questions that hopefully also expand our discussion about the case for intellectual well-being. So, what are we doing here? That to me is the case for intellectual well-being. I mean, in this brief, infinitely short time that we have to live our lives, in all these moments that are gone and gone forever after they're gone, what are we doing if we're not doing this? If you can't wake up every day and say, I want, as a person engaged in the intellectual challenge of doing education, if I can't do this every day, what am I doing? That's the question that I ask myself. This is definitely not a kind of challenge to teachers working in schools or international schools specifically. It's about all of us in education being able to ask these questions seriously of ourselves, to say, if I'm not doing this work, and I say this because I sometimes don't see it even in a university setting, then what am I doing? What is my actual job? And then to ask these questions, which hopefully are productive as well, to think about what the possibilities are specifically in the international school sector for thinking about intellectual well-being. And then lastly, and maybe most importantly, how do we translate this from what we do to how our students experience education in your classrooms, your schools around the world? So that's what I have to say today. Paul, you had a hand up for a long time and in a patient way, so I'll pass to you first and then over to you, Hermione. Thanks everyone for listening.
It's all right. I'll jump in and say thank you so much, Patrick. That was really interesting. I wonder, how does a school kind of achieve this without it being a real like checkbox, ticking exercise? So I'm going to say example from my school. As a German school, there's a lot of things that we can do to like get a tax break, right? So every teacher at my school gets €100 book voucher, right? Not voucher, but like, you can spend €100. We'll get this €100 bonus. We also get money every 3 years. So once you've been there for 3 years, it comes along every 3 years. It's a €500 kind of like bonus. You have to spend it, I think, and bring in the receipts. Now, it's for well-being, and this doesn't have to be like yoga class or something, but it could be a
Right.
yoga class. It could be German class. It could be actually glasses here aren't covered on like health insurance, so it could be glasses, but it could also be piano lessons. And I think I'm not having a go at my school. I think it's actually great, and it's really wonderful. But if I look at it after all the things you've been talking about, it seems like a really kind of superficial way to be like, yes, we are achieving this for our staff are cared for and their well-being. And we're one of those schools too. We've got mindfulness every Friday morning and that kind of thing. I wonder how you can do this without it being, a little trivial.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the 500 euros, that sounds like a pretty good starting point. I mean, it takes us back to one of the things that I mentioned, which is a concept from the Australian sociologist, educational thinker Stephen Kemmis around practice architectures. So I think one of the ways that you try and start to make it less superficial is to ask the question, what is the architecture that keeps practice in place in the way that it is at the moment? So, I mean, what you're describing is a kind of material and economic architecture, right? That there is actually, in this case, something that you can use. And if you are a bit shrewd about it, you could use it. Yeah, you could use that 500 euros for something that you think is actual well-being as opposed to something which is kind of lip service to it, right? So there is an extent to which by sort of identifying those things, by looking and saying, okay, what is it that shapes practice in my setting? You can kind of gain some agency. You can gain some empowerment by seeing what those things are and trying to affect some change on them, right? Um, but I agree that it requires a different kind of conversation. And there is a kind of there is a kind of radical imagining involved, right? That all of us, I mean, it feels to me like the conversation is generally moving ever closer towards, ironically, consensus around the fact that things are not working, right? That so many people feel to be on the same page, and yet we are not yet taking the next step of kind of radically imagining what would happen next. And I think, unfortunately for all of us, that means you have to get in trouble. That the only way to sort of start to have these conversations is to create difficult conversations, right? It's to be able to have those difficult conversations and say, in the case that you described, this is great, the 500 euros is great, but I feel like it's lip service. What else could we be doing to make this um, work better? Or yeah, the Friday mindfulness is great, but mindfulness that is future oriented is not mindfulness. It's goal setting, whatever. But I appreciate that's easy for me to say as a kind of permanently employed white male professor. That's it's easy for someone like me to say, oh, we should get in trouble at work, because of course the vast majority of people are extremely worried about getting in trouble at work for very good reasons. Because they could lose their job or lose their livelihood or be, marginalized and all of those kinds of things. So it's not easy by any means, but I think that maybe is the way to get beyond what we consider to be, yeah, superficial stuff. And I agree. The death of intellectual well-being often comes in the parametrics that are used to measure it. So if you suddenly go, okay, yeah, we need intellectual well-being, and I'm sure we could use an app to keep track of it. Then there is a real risk that the parametric, the word literally means the thing that is a reflection of the thing it's measuring. It is not that thing. Like a grade is a parametric of something to do with intelligence, right? But then there is that sleight of hand that we see so often in education, where the parametric becomes the thing, and in the process eludes the thing.
Great. Thanks, Patrick. Looks like Christian's got a question.
Yes, I think it kind of follows up on the question. First, thank you for the talk, really interesting. And I think that happy teachers make for better teachers, right? So I think that this is really quite important, and intellectually engaged teachers can make for intellectually engaged students and sort of see knowledge as valuable for its own sake, right? If you were to sort of design a system or a structure that would allow a school to do this, what would that system or structure look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you, Christian. And thank you for listening. I mean, I probably would say that I would slightly push back on the thing around happiness. That I think that actually the maybe the challenge of intellectual well-being is that it involves happiness, but it also involves being okay with not being happy. And this is the cheesy quote that I always roll out at this point, is that, that as the famous 20th century philosopher Brad Pitt once said, happiness is overrated. We have a lot of discourse that tries to drive towards happiness, but in the process can actually leave people without the teeth that they might feel they need to actually say, hang on, what the hell is going on here? So I think that one thing I would absolutely say is that I am not here as an expert in practice, and I think it would be extremely patronizing for me to say to anybody working in a school that I can tell you what would work in your setting.
Oh, I can tell, I'll answer it for everybody here. So, and it is what you said before. It's this whole idea of deviant time. Yes, please,
Yeah.
I would like the time on Tuesday to ponder the whole education system. And I think what we're all crying out for is some more time. So yes, if
Yeah.
there is an answer, I think it's that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Amani. And that's the only thing, Christian, I think that you could say is it's about trying to, well, basically trying to uncouple time in school from capital in capitalism. So schools are a place where time is converted into time capital. And where there is an expected return on investment. Let's be frank about it, right? In any school that is organized around high stakes assessment, the return on capital is certification capital. And so the higher up you go the school, the more intense the value of the time in terms of its conversion into certification capital. And that's where the kind of anxiety creeps in, and that sort of examined future colonizes the time in the present. So absolutely, the main thing would be to try and move to a more kind of collegiate atmosphere of saying, and of course, then we come back to the material and economic conditions of schooling, right? To say we basically need more teachers to teach less and think more.
Yeah,
With
that's
more time.
great. That's a great answer. Right, we're running out of time, Patrick. We've got one more question here from Ty.
Thank you for the presentation, Patrick. And at our school, we have the Visible Thinking Routine Club that I think I'm talking with your Paul and Hemingway for a while about that. And we kind of feel like we have some kind of architecture of the intellectual well-being in that club. Like, for example, like people show up voluntarily, they feel happy, they feel motivated, they keep showing up, they show motivation. And I'm wondering whether the architecture of one intellectual well-being activity can be replicated to other activity, or other activities requires other kind of architecture, because we would like to set up another club or something, and I'm kind of nervous about, like, okay, can we replicate that what's being successful in the club to other or not? So.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's really difficult because as you've kind of intimated there, the conditions for doing this work are really fragile. They often just depend on the right group of people getting together at the right time and for it working. So I think one of the things is maybe that recognizing that fragility, recognizing that it can be quite ephemeral, means that if it doesn't work the second time, that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's just the nature of the conditions that you're working in. That because the model doesn't work the second time doesn't mean that it didn't work the first time. So that would be my thinking on that. But at the same time, I think it's great to say, okay, well, what could we think of as the design principles for a context for intellectual well-being that works. And again, maybe that's more, and Paul and I discussed this the other day, more about kind of setting the direction of travel, that kind of vector setting, to say, well, the intention is to go in this direction. We don't know where we're going to get to or what the route will be, but so long as the intention remains the same, you're on the right track.
Okay. Thank you.
I think we better call it quits there. But thanks so much, Patrick. That was really interesting. I think I've definitely got my intellectual well-being for the day, especially given I'm on holidays. And thanks so much for everyone for all their questions and everyone for listening and turning up in the afternoon. And I don't know where you are, but it's very, very sunny here. And it's been really lovely. So thanks so much.
Thanks everybody. And I just wanted to share my email there at the end if anyone wants to get in touch. And also I'll share the slides with you so that everyone can access that article as well if they want to read more. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
No worries.